July 5, 1943, Kursk, Western Russia. The earth shook as thousands of German tanks rolled forward. Among them were the newest predators of the battlefield, the Panthers. Their long guns cracked like thunder, shells tearing through soil and steel alike. Inside a Soviet T-34, Sergeant Ivan Petrov wiped sweat from his brow. The metal walls rattled with every explosion. He could barely hear the orders shouted over the deafening roar. Around him, his crew worked frantically loading shells, cranking levers, steering their machine into position. Through the periscope, Ivan saw them, dark silhouettes of Panthers advancing in a line, bigger, heavier, deadlier. Every Soviet tanker had heard the stories. Panthers could destroy a T-34 at over 2 kilometers. The Soviet gun had to get dangerously close just to stand a chance. The first Soviet tank ahead of them erupted in flames. Another followed, its crew scrambling from the hatch only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Ivan gritted his teeth. He knew what the odds were. Everyone inside that T-34 knew. Yet retreat was not an option. Orders were clear. Hold the line at Kursk. Survive if you can. Die if you must. Ivan slammed the hatch shut, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Forward!" The T-34 lurched into motion, charging straight toward the storm, and in that moment, survival became more than a matter of steel or firepower. It became a test of courage against machines built to dominate the battlefield. Long before the summer battles of 1943, the Soviet Union had already placed its hope in a single machine, the T-34. Born in the late 1930s, the T-34 was not built in luxury. It was forged in the urgency of survival. Soviet engineers designed it to be simple, reliable, and built for the vast steppes of Russia. Wide tracks gave it grip in mud and snow. Sloped armor deflected shells better than flat plates. A powerful diesel engine carried it across long distances, and most importantly, it could be produced in staggering numbers. When the Germans first invaded in June 1941, the T-34 stunned them. At that time, few German weapons could penetrate its armor. To many Soviet soldiers, it felt invincible, a shield of steel that gave them a fighting chance in a war that otherwise seemed hopeless. But war changes quickly. By 1943, the T-34 was no longer the terror it once was. German weapons had caught up. The arrival of new tanks like the Tiger and the Panther turned the battlefield into a place where the T-34 suddenly seemed outdated. And yet, it remained the heart of the Red Army. For every Panther the Germans produced, the Soviets built 10 T-34 seconds. Entire factories in the Ural Mountains worked day and night, their workers laboring in freezing conditions, often sleeping beside the assembly lines. The tank was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol, a machine that belonged to the people who built it, and to the soldiers who climbed inside it. For the crews, the T-34 was both home and coffin. Cramped, noisy, and often unbearably hot or freezing, it demanded everything from the men who fought within. Many crews carried icons, photographs, or letters inside their tanks, reminders of the world beyond steel walls. They knew the average lifespan of a tanker in battle could be measured in weeks. And still, they climbed in, closed the hatches, and drove forward. Because the T-34 was more than just metal. It was the will of a nation, the only machine that stood between survival and destruction. In the summer of 1943, as Soviet crews clung to their T-34 seconds, a new shadow rolled onto the battlefield. The Germans called it the Panzerkampfwagen 5. The world would remember it as the Panther. Born out of desperation after the shock of facing the T-34 inches 1941, the Panther was Germany's answer, a tank built not for speed or numbers, but for dominance. It combined heavy armor with a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun. From over 2 kilometers away, it could destroy a T-34 with a single shot. Its sloped armor, inspired ironically by the T-34 itself, made it resistant to most Soviet weapons. To many German tankers, the Panther felt like perfection. Inside, it carried advanced optics, giving its crews sharper vision on the battlefield. Its wide tracks allowed it to cross terrain where other German machines often faltered. For soldiers who had struggled against Soviet armor in the first years of the war, the arrival of the Panther felt like regaining control. The Soviets noticed immediately. Reports from Kursk described T-34 shells bouncing off Panther armor, harmless as pebbles against stone. Crews spoke of charging into range only to see their comrades' tanks ignite before they could fire. One Soviet veteran later said, "It was like fighting wolves with bare hands." But perfection came with a price. The Panther was complex, expensive, and slow to build. Each one demanded months of skilled labor and resources Germany was rapidly losing. When the first Panthers rolled out in early 1943, they were rushed into battle at Kursk. Many broke down mechanically before they could even fire a shot. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and fuel shortages left them stranded. Yet even with flaws, the Panther was a terrifying predator. On open ground it ruled. For T-34 crews, survival now meant more than courage. It meant finding ways to fight an enemy machine that outgunned and out-armored them at nearly every turn. The rise of the Panther changed the war's rhythm. No longer could the Soviets rely on the T-34's early advantage. From now on, every battle would be a contest not only of machines, but of tactics, numbers, and sheer endurance. And in the fields of Kursk, that contest was about to reach its greatest test. Soviet crews clung to their T-34 seconds. A new shadow rolled onto the battlefield. The Germans called it the Panzerkampfwagen 5. The world would remember it as the Panther. Born out of desperation after the shock of facing the T-34 inches 1941, the Panther was Germany's answer, a tank built not for speed or numbers, but for dominance. It combined heavy armor with a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun. From over 2 kilometers away, it could destroy a T-34 with a single shot. Its sloped armor, inspired ironically by the T-34 itself, made it resistant to most Soviet weapons. To many German tankers, the Panther felt like perfection. Inside, it carried advanced optics, giving its crews sharper vision on the battlefield. Its wide tracks allowed it to cross terrain where other German machines often faltered. For soldiers who had struggled against Soviet armor in the first years of the war, the arrival of the Panther felt like regaining control. The Soviets noticed immediately. Reports from Kursk described T-34 shells bouncing off Panther armor, harmless as pebbles against stone. Crews spoke of charging into range only to see their comrades' tanks ignite before they could fire. One Soviet veteran later said, "It was like fighting wolves with bare hands." But perfection came with a price. The Panther was complex, expensive, and slow to build. Each one demanded months of skilled labor and resources Germany was rapidly losing. When the first Panthers rolled out in early 1943, they were rushed into battle at Kursk. Many broke down mechanically before they could even fire a shot. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and fuel shortages left them stranded. Yet even with flaws, the Panther was a terrifying predator. On open ground, it ruled. For T-34 crews, survival now meant more than courage. It meant finding ways to fight an enemy machine that outgunned and out-armored them at nearly every turn. The rise of the Panther changed the war's rhythm. No longer could the Soviets rely on the T-34's early advantage. From now on, every battle would be a contest not only of machines, but of tactics, numbers, and sheer endurance. And in the fields of Kursk, that contest was about to reach its greatest test. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next battlefield story. Also, let me know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. The fields of Kursk in July 1943 were littered with burning wrecks. Dozens of T-34 seconds smoldered beside shattered Panthers. Yet somehow, Soviet crews continued to fight. Their survival did not come from superior machines. It came from learning how to outthink the predators that stalked them. The first tactic was simple, but deadly. Close the distance. Panthers could kill a T-34 from over 2 kilometers away. The T-34's gun could not. Soviet tankers had to rush forward, weaving between smoke and wreckage, until they reached point-blank range. At less than 500 meters, their shells had a chance of punching through the Panther's side armor. It was a gamble that often cost lives, but for those who succeeded, it was the only way to even the odds. The second tactic was strength in numbers. Soviet commanders threw T-34 seconds into battle in waves. For every Panther destroyed, several T-34 seconds might be lost, but the swarm worked. Panthers could not fire fast enough to stop all of them. Once surrounded, even the strongest German tank became vulnerable. Crews also used terrain as a weapon. T-34 seconds hid in tree lines, sunken roads, and behind ridges, waiting for Panthers to expose their flanks. Many Soviet veterans described the tension of these ambushes lying in silence, engines off, until the enemy passed within range. Then, a sudden burst of fire, and the battlefield erupted. And when all else failed, there was the most desperate tactic of all, the ram. If a T-34 could not penetrate a Panther, some crews chose to slam their machines directly into the enemy, crushing tracks, jamming turrets, and creating chaos long enough for others to strike. These suicidal maneuvers became symbols of Soviet determination, proof that courage could sometimes substitute for firepower. A Soviet tanker later recalled, "We knew the Panthers were stronger, but we also knew we could not stop. If one of us fell, another would take his place." Through these tactics, the Red Army slowly blunted the power of the Panther. Losses were immense, but survival was possible. Against all odds, the T-34 crews proved that ingenuity, sacrifice, and sheer will could turn a hopeless fight into a chance at victory. And as the battles dragged on, the Soviets prepared to unveil a weapon that would finally give their tankers the firepower they so desperately needed. Inside every T-34, 5 men lived and fought in a world of steel no larger than a small room. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. The roar of the engine shook their bones. And when shells struck the armor, the sound was deafening like a hammer against a coffin. For these crews, survival meant more than facing the Panther. It meant enduring the brutal conditions of their own machine. Temperatures inside the tank could soar in the summer and freeze in the winter. The space was so cramped that men often fought shoulder to shoulder, unable to stretch their legs for hours. Every movement was mechanical, the loader ramming shells into the breech, the gunner peering through his sight, the driver gripping controls with blistered hands. They ate when they could, often cold rations pulled from pockets. Sleep came in snatches, stolen on the hard floor of the tank or under it when the battle paused. Letters from home were read again and again, folded into uniforms as reminders that life still existed beyond the battlefield. The bond between crew members was unbreakable. Each man's survival depended entirely on the others. If the driver hesitated, the gunner might die. If the loader faltered, the commander's orders meant nothing. They trusted each other with their lives, knowing that any moment might be their last. Many crews carried personal tokens, a photograph, a religious icon, or even a scrap of cloth from home. These small objects became lifelines of memory, proof that they were more than soldiers sealed in steel. The average lifespan of a Soviet tanker at the front was shockingly short. Some survived only weeks before their machines were hit. Veterans later admitted that they entered battle expecting death. One wrote, "We climbed into our tanks as men were already buried. And yet, they fought. They laughed when they could, sang when they dared, and found courage in each other. Their humanity became their greatest weapon, because it gave them a reason to endure." This was the hidden side of the T-34 war. Not only battles of steel and fire, but battles of spirit, waged inside cramped turrets and shaking hulls. And just when the struggle seemed endless, the Soviets prepared to reveal a new machine, one that promised to give their tank crews hope against the Panthers. The survival of the T-34 was not decided only on the battlefield. It was decided in the factories. While German engineers built tanks like craftsmen shaping jewels, Soviet workers built them like hammers, forged in fire and urgency. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, powerful, precise, but fragile. The T-34 was a tool of survival, simple, rugged, and unstoppable in numbers. In 1943, as the Red Army braced for new offensives, Soviet factories deep in the Ural Mountains thundered day and night. Women, children, and elderly workers filled the assembly lines, while younger men fought at the front. Many lived beside the machines, sleeping on cots between shifts, working in freezing halls with little food. Their sacrifice poured directly into steel. Every 30 minutes, a new T-34 rolled out. Weld seams were rough, paint was thin, but the tanks ran. Crews could be trained quickly to use them, and repairs could be made with the simplest tools. By contrast, the Panther required precision parts, expert mechanics, and long training for its crews. On paper, it was the superior tank. In reality, it was too rare to hold back the tide. For every Panther that rolled out of a German factory, the Soviets produced 10 T-34 seconds. In 1943 alone, nearly 20,000 were built. Germany, strained by Allied bombing and dwindling resources, struggled to match even a fraction of that number. And then came the mechanical curse of the Panther. Engines overheated, transmissions failed. Many broke down before reaching the front. Crews often abandoned their tanks not because of enemy fire, but because their own machines betrayed them. A Soviet tanker later remarked, "The Panther was deadly, yes, but only if it could move." The industrial balance was clear. Germany built predators. The Soviet Union built survivors. This flood of machines changed the psychology of war. Soviet crews climbed into new tanks even after losing old ones, knowing replacements would come. German crews, in their rare and costly Panthers, felt the pressure of being outnumbered again and again. One mistake, one breakdown, and the battlefield would swallow them whole. In this war of machines, it was not perfection that mattered, it was endurance, and endurance favored the T-34. But as the Soviets pressed forward, they knew numbers alone could not end the struggle. To face the Panthers on equal terms, they would need something more, a new design that could finally give their tankers hope of fighting head-to-head. The battles of 1943 had proven one truth. The standard T-34 could not face the Panther or the Tiger on equal terms. Soviet commanders understood this. If their crews were to survive, the tank of the people needed to evolve. The answer came in 1944, with the arrival of the T-34 divided by 85. On the surface, it looked familiar, the same sloped armor, the same wide tracks, the same reliable engine. But atop the hull rose a new, larger turret, housing a powerful 85mm gun. At last, Soviet crews had a weapon that could pierce the armor of a Panther, even from longer ranges. For the men who climbed inside, the difference was immediate. No longer did they feel like prey, forced to rush dangerously close. Now, they could meet their enemy head-on. One tanker recalled the first time his unit faced Panthers with the new model. "For the first time, we did not run toward them. We stood our ground. And when we fired, we saw the Panthers burn." The psychological shift was enormous. Confidence replaced despair. Crews who once entered battles expecting death now fought with the belief that survival was possible. The Red Army began to regain momentum, pushing German forces westward across Ukraine, Poland, and into the heart of Eastern Europe. But the turning of the tide was not only about technology, it was about experience. By 1944, Soviet crews had learned hard lessons from years of struggle. They understood how to swarm, how to flank, and how to use terrain. The T-34 divided by 85 gave them the tool they needed, but it was their resilience and sacrifice that turned battles into victories. German reports grew increasingly desperate. Panthers still inflicted heavy losses, but they could no longer dominate. Their mechanical failures continued, their numbers dwindled, and everywhere they went, more and more T-34 seconds appeared to meet them. The war of endurance was finally tipping in favor of the Soviets. For tank crews like Sergeant Ivan Petrov and his comrades, the change was life itself. They no longer fought only for survival. They fought for victory. Each battle carried the memory of those lost in earlier years, comrades burned in thin-armored T-34 seconds, men who had charged against impossible odds. Now, every destroyed Panther felt like justice for the sacrifices that had come before. The tide had turned, and as the Red Army drove westward, the question was no longer whether the T-34 could survive. It was how far it could carry them all the way to Berlin. The turning of the tide did not erase the cost of war. For every Soviet tank that rolled forward, another burned behind. Survival against the Panthers and Tigers was never guaranteed. Even with the new T-34 divided by 85, the statistics were staggering. During the battles of 1944 alone, tens of thousands of T-34 seconds were lost. For every Panther destroyed, many T-34 crews gave their lives. German gunners often described Soviet assaults as endless waves. And to the tankers inside, that was exactly what it felt like charging forward, knowing that only some would return. Life expectancy for a Soviet crew was brutally short. Many veterans later admitted they climbed into their tanks each day expecting not to see the next sunrise. A gunner wrote in his memoir, "We were alive only between battles. Once the engine started, we counted ourselves already dead. The human cost was unbearable." Crews often watched their comrades' tanks explode only meters away, knowing there was no time to help. Survivors of such infernos carried the memories forever. Some never spoke of it. Others confessed in broken words decades later, haunted by the screams of friends they could not save. And yet, through this constant loss, the Soviets endured. Replacement crews were trained rapidly, sometimes with only weeks of instruction. Teenagers barely old enough to shave climbed into the steel coffins once manned by veterans. They learned on the battlefield itself, guided by nothing more than courage and desperation. The resilience of these men was extraordinary. They repaired tanks under fire, scavenged parts from wrecks, and returned to battle again and again. Each survival was a miracle. Each victory came soaked in sacrifice. German crews, too, recognized the determination of their opponents. One Panther commander admitted after the war, "We could destroy many of them, but they always came back. There was no end." The price of survival was not measured only in numbers. It was measured in the eyes of those who lived eyes that carried grief, exhaustion, and the silent question of why they had been spared when so many had not. By the time the Red Army approached Germany's borders in 1945, the T-34 had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of endurance, carried forward on the backs of men who knew survival came at unimaginable cost. But the war was not yet over. Ahead lay the final campaign, the road to Berlin, where the T-34 would write the last chapter of its story.